And last on our panel is Professor Jennifer Bremer from the School of Global and Public Affairs at Public Policy, at American University in Cairo. She's a professor of practice of public policy and chair of the department. And before joining AUC, she worked for many years in Latin America, at the Washington Center of the Kennan Institute of Private Enterprise. And so we look forward to hearing about some Latin American examples, which will complement the other panel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Diane. I should say that although I have worked in all of the countries that I'm going to be talking about for brief periods or long periods, as the case may be, I have not personally worked on these specific projects, so this is an academic presentation in the sense that it comes from other people's stuff. I want to begin by emphasizing, and this sort of builds on, I think, the other two speakers, that we are talking about different aspects of upgrading and what do you do when your city is largely informal. I think there is still very much a mindset that informality is somehow the exception, somehow it's something happening at the margin, but in fact, at this point, the majority of the people, certainly in Cairo, live in informal areas, and increasingly in the world, in all developing country cities, the majority are informal, and this is where the most of the growth is taking place, is in informal cities. So if we're really going to get development right, if that's a concept that one can even really articulate what right means, we have to consider how to fully include the informal areas and the informal cities into what's happening in the economy, in the political life, in the social life, and so forth. So there are a whole different range of types of upgrading that we would like to see happen to make these areas first more livable, but also to create more opportunity there and to incorporate them more fully into the life of the city, and of course to make the people there have access to the full range of citizenship rights. This may be physical upgrading, water and power and roads, always the first on every poor person's list that I've ever talked to. Upgrading of housing, which may mean financing and consulting, not necessarily building. Government services such as education and health, how to formalize tenure or at least provide secure tenure through titling, for example, economic activities, and developing what I hereby coin as the investor microclimate. What is the climate for investing in informal areas, whether that is as a housing developer, as a small enterprise, as any kind of an activity, a social enterprise. The question of governance, how do you normalize the government presence and really ensure that as citizens their rights are fully respected? And what about their own social capital and their ability to claim accountability and this other aspect of citizenship? Where's the government in all this, including security? Often the first thing that people from outside the area will cite, oh, what about the crime? Like they don't have crime in Mahdi. But the police presence, the human rights, and how do you control crime? A set of key considerations that I want to highlight. First, the role of government is key, but it is not the only factor. Informal areas, secondly, informal areas are communities, not housing stock. So much of this conversation, I find in Egypt, is dominated by the question of housing. Housing's important. People need houses. People spend a lot of time in their houses. But nonetheless, these are full communities. They have all of the aspects of any community, whether that's nonprofit organizations, and we have at least two of them represented here today, but also businesses and every other kind of activity. And moreover, in Egyptian informal areas, housing is not the primary problem. The primary problem is in these other areas, particularly the availability of infrastructure and government services. So I want to also include two quotes from Cities Alliance, which is more or less of a World Bank program that is very much dedicated to recognizing that cities are where the growth of human residents is going to take place, and how can we make these cities stronger and more vibrant and more economically viable and so forth. These are both quotes from them saying that upgrading of slums is not limited to housing construction or upgrading of existing buildings. The social component of the entire process is key, with the ultimate objective being the guarantee of access to life skills and to better living conditions. We're talking about people, we're not talking about buildings. And another quote from them is that with successful slum upgrading, 3 processes occur simultaneously over time. First, the slum dweller, and I also do not like the term slum, but this is a quote, the slum dweller becomes the citizen, the shack becomes the house, the slum becomes the suburb. Some people say, what's the difference between being an informal area and being a part of the core, what's considered the core sort of urban fabric of Cairo? I figure it's about 700 years. Because the Islamic areas were informal when they were built. Those weren't planned by anybody. They weren't laid out necessarily by anybody but the people themselves. And now they're considered the core of the city. We see that same process happening in the informal areas. So I'm going to be talking obviously about Latin America. Here's an example. You've seen some other pictures of informal areas in Latin America. Look quite similar to informal areas here. Tend to be a lot of brick construction. The houses there are to some extent smaller than what you would see in Cairo informal areas. They tend to be built on the hillsides because of the lack of access to the land on the flat areas, which has been taken by the formal economy. So we have a number of questions to be answered. The institutional approach to working with the community. Who is the counterpart? When we say working with the community, who do we mean? How do we work with the community? What specific groups would we try to engage with? Sustainability. Is this a permanent improvement or short-lived? Coverage. Is this approach or this intervention scalable? Can it be increased in size to cover at least a large share of the people who are living in informal areas? Or is it dependent on donor initiatives here, there, maybe someplace else? And how does it address the very question of illegality, which is at the root of informality? We say informality, but we actually mean not implemented in accordance with the law, i.e. illegal. Do we solve it? Do we work around it? What do we do with it? Implementation, what's the role of government versus non-government actors? And finally, always the big question, financing. Where is it going to come from? Who is going to pay for what? How is this money going to be mobilized? So there are a number of different international examples. We heard an example from India. There are many really fascinating examples of what's going on in India in areas of affordable housing strategies and upgrading. In Thailand, there's a very highly recognized experience of using cooperatives as a way to organize people. Tanzania, you have housing finance examples. In South Africa, informal business strategies, as well as many different housing strategies that have been tried. But I'm going to be talking about the first 3 in Peru, an experience with how do you give title to people who live in informal areas. In Brazil, an experience in Rio, famous for its favelas, for its informal areas on hillsides, and how those were integrated better into the city, still not completely done. And in Mexico, a very, I think, very encouraging example of how a large company became engaged in informal area upgrading as a business, not strictly speaking as a small charitable project. So in Peru, an organization called COFOPRI, never mind, they were formed by the government as the result of an initiative from a think tank called the Institute for Liberty and Democracy. Many of you will have heard, I hope, of Hernando de Soto, who is the founder of the Institute for Liberty and Democracy, which has been very active for a couple of decades in bringing attention to the economic activities that are carried out by poor people in the informal economy, and how to address those problems and how to deal with them. I would also note that he was scheduled to come here, and the government did not approve the presentation. So there you go. We're still playing the same games we've been playing. So the Institute for Liberty and Democracy undertook a 6-year effort of research and pilot projects to begin to put a legal reform in place. In other words, and this is, I think, a key point, experience indicates that reform needs to be based on experimentation and working with the people to find solutions that have the potential to be scaled up. They introduced a new law that simplified the tenure process and in particular reduced the role of the notary, which in Egypt is also a significant problem, the Shahr al-Qadi. And how do you really reduce that block that office constitutes for granting title? There was a $38 million World Bank loan that enabled them to implement this project, and their goal was to grant 1 million titles, and this goal was set by the president at that time, Fujimori, who really adopted this program as something that he felt could show that he cared about the common people. This was shortly before he was forced to leave the country. But in any case, the importance of political support to accomplish something like this has to be emphasized. This is a picture of Lima, again, slightly more colorful than a lot of areas, but still you're talking about brick and concrete pillars on hillsides. The principles that they relied on to make this program work were first that property rights should be granted based on customary proofs of ownership, the kinds of things that ordinary people have, whether those are informal agreements with the person they bought it from, electricity bills, communicating with the community and saying, okay, where are the borders and so forth, and using simplified procedures. The formalistic and bureaucratic procedures should be eliminated. If possible, not only for informal areas, you can't really have one set of laws for one part of your city and another for another, but ideally simplify the process for everyone, and that the procedures should be, not only should they be simple, but they should be robust, to be applied in many different situations. They should be upgradable so that people can expand the security of their tenure over time. And also incentives have to be built in so that when they sell the property, it doesn't again become informal, that the property remains formal. And the political support really can be mobilized by showing that this program, in addition to, doesn't just hand out pieces of paper, it really can change people's lives, and it can contribute to social justice by giving people formal ownership over the assets that they themselves have built. However, there have been some negative aspects somewhat more recently. There's some evidence that the progress that was made has been reversed, and that the politically powerful, seeing some of these areas as becoming more desirable to develop, have in fact tried to reformalize the process so that to facilitate them taking the land. There also has not been as much expansion in the mortgage market as was hoped. The financial markets have not followed as much, but there have been other important financial benefits from security, in particular more economic integration of the people living in these areas into the city, more businesses, more time available for them to work on their businesses, as opposed to having to deal with some of the aspects of informality than was the case in the past. Important achievements were also made. They were able, in the 6-year period after the law was changed, to go beyond their target of 1 million. Seems pretty ambitious, but they actually achieved 1.3 million registered titles. They cut the time required to formally register a title from 7 years to 45 days. And the 7 years here would be an optimistic estimate of how long it would take you to formalize a title, by the way. The administrative steps were cut from 207 to 30. The number of offices that you had to visit were cut from 54 to 4. And the average cost, was cut from over $2,000 to only $49. So these changes enabled, these were the changes that enabled those 1 million people to gain title by reducing these costs. So relevance to Cairo. Well, first off, security is in the eye of the beholder. We all know that, in fact, although in some legal sense, or in almost any legal sense, the land tenure in informal areas is either, if it's military land or government land, the title, there's really not formal title. If it's agricultural land, there is formal title, but not the right to build, so there is still a gap between the formal system and the reality. But nonetheless, very few areas are actually at risk. There are evictions, they do happen, especially in desirable properties, but most people, in fact, have day-to-day security. But you do have to ask, who is eyeing the land? Who is looking at this land? The Jordanian and Turkish experience indicates that money talks, and even where people had, through years of effort, implemented informal or semi-formal ways to strengthen their title. They did not have real legal title, and many of those people, as the city expanded, the land became more valuable. Some of the informal areas that were lauded for having really solidified their hold on the land lost their land. So this is something we really have to be alert to as a danger in Egypt, and why you can't necessarily rely on the status quo to provide security to the people. Therefore, it's important to find a way to really secure a legal title for informal area residents. But the solution that was done in Peru may or may not be a solution that can be scaled up in Egypt. There is one of the key differences, and it's a mysterious missing element, although Nick Hopkins claims it's a long-standing mystery, as to why in Egyptian communities you don't see the kinds of large membership organizations that you see in Latin America or you see in Asia, where people in a community are able to organize and go and pursue things politically. Doesn't seem to happen here, and I don't think it can be entirely attributed to the Mubarak regime or what have you. It seems to be something that people find more difficulty in doing here. So this is a factor, because in many cases, organizing people into a group to be able to pursue this together is an important part of the process. Second experience here, the Brazilian Rio Favela Bairro program. It's generally regarded as highly successful. It began in 1993, so not a new experience. The key objectives were to provide urban improvements, especially urban infrastructure, and to create and provide access to urban facilities for social benefits. So you had the physical infrastructure and you had social assets as well, with the aim of integrating the favelas, the informal areas, into the urban fabric, and to consolidate the favela as a neighborhood, rather than just a collection of houses that people had built over time, but to really make it into more of a community. This, for example, is an area called San Remo in Rio, what it looked like in '96. This is what it looks like now. And you can see, for example, that the buildings are higher. Some improvements have been made to the quality. And this is what you see in informal areas. They're not static. They expand and improve the facilities over time, bit by bit. They may start with an illegal system, move to a formal system. We're doing some research on that now, trying to look at the process whereby infrastructure, with the collaboration of Hagaid from Hospital Hagana, to understand what is the process whereby infrastructure has been brought into this community over time, over 30 years plus. The city first established complementary land ownership and income generation programs. So they did some titling, but they also looked at the economic activity. And this is something I really see as missing from efforts here, to recognize that informal areas are sites of thousands and thousands and thousands of very viable businesses, mostly small, some large, but a lot of economic activity. The project cost was $300 million, of which more than half came from the Inter-American Development Bank, which is like a Latin American version of the World Bank, and the rest came from the city. It served a population of 250,000 people, reaching across 60 different favelas, but this is a cost of $1,000 per person. It's not a low cost to implement this kind of activity. The main elements included infrastructure and upgrades to make the favela more like a normal neighborhood. This included visual symbols of the formal city that would identify it as a neighborhood, paving the streets, installing plazas and popular squares and medans, and urban furniture such as benches and shelters and so forth, and also public services. The absence of public space in informal areas is a huge problem here, because when people built it, everybody bought a piece of land and they built their houses on it, and they didn't leave open spaces for schools or for parks or medans or anything else. And then going in and retrofitting that is quite difficult, just because all the space is taken. So creativity and so forth has to be used. They also included the favelas in the planning process of the city. They just said, okay, they're there, we know it, we're going to stop denying it, and we're really going to include them in our planning process. Of course, they had a planning process, which put them ahead of the game. They also looked at social activities, daycare centers, income generation, training, sports facilities, a range of activities that would help to strengthen the community itself, and then legalizing the subdivision with land titles. Some of the important features of the program itself were that they held the design competition, and these competitions, we're hoping to implement one of these in Hospital Hagana as a way of communicating with the community and attracting attention to, in this case, a project to expand the public services in the ESBA, to bring in schools and medical facilities. And they held a competition so that young architects could bring in ideas, as well as established firms, to identify some creative ideas. As was indicated by Lindsay, there's a real need for creativity in finding solutions to these problems and for involving the community in that. They promoted a new relationship between the technical experts and the people from these areas, because there's often, obviously, a class separation or a demonization of people in the informal areas, and this really helped to break that down, help the professionals to really see the people in these areas as fellow citizens and people with some very interesting to work on problems, and also a lot of potential to be part of the solution. Some of the innovations, they included creating a center for urban and social assessment and placing it in an informal area, bringing in not just schools and hospitals, which are important, but also putting a government facility in the area. Having the municipal government in collaboration with the community, with different community agents, different people, groups in the community, assist the residents to develop public and private space. So they really help to mobilize people, get them to collaborate together in improving their community, therefore strengthening their sense of community. They created training centers for artisans and skilled labor, computer stations for training of youth and adults, focusing on generating new sources of income, again, not just housing, not just infrastructure, and supporting the establishment of cooperatives and shops to help in organizing the commerce and the business of the area. Policing is the next challenge. There's a big push on the policing issue. Unlike most of the informal areas in Egypt, in Rio, they have a real problem with some of the areas being under the control of criminal gangs, drug gangs that actually control and operate the area. They've had cases where the police have gone in, and then the police kind of don't stay, and the drug gangs come back. So they've had a lot of problems with that. And they introduced video surveillance and also actually hiring police to be posted there full time. And this is a picture of a policeman surveilling there, looking at all the cameras. They have more cameras than in London, proportionately. So they're really trying to improve the policing of the area. So lessons for Egypt: the importance of a multi-sectoral approach, the need to bring in multiple agencies. That means it's not just the Informal Settlements Development Fund or whatever. All of the core agencies have to be involved, and that's a huge challenge for implementation. There is a crippling impact of the lack of funds and the lack of local government. These programs are not cheap. They're cheaper than building from scratch in most cases, but nonetheless, there really has to be local involvement and local governance. In the spectrum of informality, informal governance, the lack of the ability of the government to play within the rules as well, is one of the huge problems here. And we hope to see decentralization, but we're still waiting for a parliament. So the final one, Patrimonio hoy, which is a program of a company called Cemex, which some of you will have heard of. They're a major Mexican cement company, multinational, also operating in Egypt with a plant in Asyut. They found that self-construction accounted for 40% of their sales, and therefore this got their attention. And they developed this program. Patrimonio hoy more or less means family wealth today. And they began in '98, first by trying to learn that when they realized that 40% of their sales were going to people building their own homes, mostly informal, and they realized they knew nothing about that. So they first began by studying it. Here's some pictures of the program that resulted. And it was a response to an economic crisis. They saw that, low income and informal sales had fallen less than in an economic crisis that they were experiencing, their formal sales fell a lot more, and the informal sales not so much, because there was a bank crisis, and surprise, informal people don't rely on bank finance. So they were still able to finance. So therefore they switched from selling cement to building houses. And they launched the full-scale program in 2000, and they broke even financially in 2004. This is an interesting program because it is not a CSR program. This is a business program, and they're now expanding it all over Latin America. And the basic structure is they use microcredit with technical assistance from hired architects to help people decide how to improve their homes. The focus is on improving, not building from scratch. And there is a collaboration with other material suppliers. Cemex is a big, powerful company, and they twisted arms to get good pricing for the other inputs that are required to produce a total package of inputs that what you need to build your house. This many bags of cement, this much rebar, this much plaster, etc. And the participants build their homes or additions 3 times faster than the others because they have this microcredit. And the average cost is 1/3 of what it costs to build normally in Mexico. And the participants gain some access to credit. And originally they were using group lending, but now they seem to have shifted to individual lending. The sustainable benefits, most participants say they would not have been able to build their house without the program. So it really makes a difference. The home's market value increases an average of 20%. Higher quality, better functionality. There are real direct benefits from this for the people that participate. It creates jobs among local masons, and most of the people who go around and do the organizing are women. So here's a picture of people building their houses, same kinds of things you would see here. And about 1/3 use their homes or extra rooms for business. Home-based business is a really critical part of the economy of most low-income people, and this is supported by being able to have a better place to do business, more room, etc. A small share of the payment goes also to build a local classroom in the neighborhood to build the community as a whole. However, only about 1/3 of those who enter the program actually finish. So this is a major problem they're trying to deal with. Achievement of scale. Since 2000, they have reached more than 1 million people throughout Latin America. This is not a small 500 houses kind of operation. They've advanced more than $135 million in credit. 400,000 families have been assisted to build or expand their homes, and they have 100 centers, as I mentioned. They're now expanding this in part with a loan guarantee from, again, the Inter-American Development Bank, which would benefit up to 750,000 families in the coming years. So as part of this, they also have a program to improve your street, which works very much the same way. It's lent to a group of people. They take a microcredit loan to build the road. Has to be cement. This is what Cemex sells. So they want the road to be cement. Here's an example of a before and after. This is better than that. So this is built by the people themselves with cement and microcredit. The benefits, of course, roads are good. They help people travel. They increase safety. They improve access for services, and property values rise. So if you combine these with government funding and community contributions, you can achieve a lot. Most projects are completed in only 70 weeks compared to the usual 10 years for a government project. Also a problem here. So speeding these things up is very important, and they're now also providing improvements to schools and other kinds of things. So they've made, this is a smaller program, they've made 35,000 microloans, and 7,000 families have benefited. The lessons for Egypt are, first, there is the potential to mobilize companies on a for-profit basis, not just a nonprofit basis, which dramatically increases the ability to grow to scale. The importance of self-help inputs. These communities were built by the people themselves. So you're looking at 80% of the housing stock that has been added to Cairo in the past couple of decades has been done by poor people building their own houses. This is the way housing is done here. It's the way communities are built here. It's a strategy that cannot just be pushed aside, but it is a strategy where some additional inputs would make it lead to better overall outcomes for the people by helping them to build a community as well as building their houses. There is the potential to reach scale through this, and my question is, would somebody please call CEMEX? Where are they? They don't have this program here, and I don't know why.